Good afternoon, you're watching the news at 1. My name is Nzinga Kunda. Let's take a look at the top stories we're following at this hour. President Cyril Ramaphosa stresses government's plan to advance socio-economic development in his Freedom Day address in Bloemfontein. And Freedom Day celebrations marred as 7 people are killed as a train plows into a pickup truck at a crossing in Cape Town. Good afternoon. President Cyril Ramaphosa says the country needs to use this Freedom Day to affirm the determination to intensify the struggle of socio-economic freedom for all South Africans. Speaking during the Freedom Day celebrations in Bloemfontein, Ramaphosa says the level of unemployment in the country is still very high and says this is contributing to high levels of poverty. Ramaphosa has acknowledged that many communities still need proper housing as well as proper municipal services, and that a lot still needs to be done to bridge the gap between rich and poor.
Our people cannot be free if they do not have jobs. Our people cannot be free if they do not have education and if they do not have better livelihoods. We know that the advent of democracy did not automatically heal the divisions of the past. We must work resolutely to remove the obstacles that still divide our society and strengthen the many ties that bind us together. For example, we still, as the National Development Plan said, we are still divided on a number of fronts. We are still divided between black and white. We are still divided between young and old. We are still divided between rich and poor, between rural and urban. We are still divided in many, many ways. Our task is to try and bridge those divisions. Our task as a nation in formation is to make sure that those gaps and those divisions are closed. On a day like this,
joining us in studio is Lebo Pheko, who's a political and economic analyst. Thanks so much for your time on SABC News. How do we define freedom?
Good question. So I think freedom, there's a difference between freedom and liberation. So freedom really is a set of principles that enable us to live our lives in equitably, with a sense of access to voice, access to communication, access to information, access to social rights, and so on and so forth. But I think that it takes us away from the liberation discourse. And I think liberation, when we speak about a self-determined sense of how as a country we decide and determine who we are and what we're going to be, to argue that we're a bit far away from that.
We're celebrating Freedom Day today. We saw President Cyril Ramaphosa noting that there is still a lot to be done in terms of South Africa and this freedom that we are celebrating. I think I'd go a little bit further into that and take a look at our Bill of Rights and the rights that all South Africans are supposed to have, the right to freedom of movement, the right to dignity. Are we close to achieving any of those things as a country?
So I think the difficulty with South Africa is that it was born into an era where there was an international prescript which had determined what our freedom is supposed to look like, what our liberation is supposed to look like, and that includes the economy. And we're born into an era which was very determined to push a market-led economic framework, and a particular Western form of governance which speaks about democracy as expressed through elections, as expressed through the pillars of constitutionalism. And yet, when one looks at how freedom and liberation have been framed by our neighboring countries who came into this era 30 years before us, it's a completely different construction. And I've found that, in my opinion, the South African construction is a bit wishy-washy, and it's found incredibly lacking. If we were truly free, I think that we wouldn't have the levels of inequality which have actually grown since 1994, and that the majority of African people in this country are far worse off than they were before 1994. And I think when we speak about freedom, we should think about social mobility. We should think about the kind of a national program which takes us forward, which takes our economy forward, our politics forward. We should also be far more mature about the way that we frame freedom as a liberation imperative, one which we should be willing to imagine collectively. And I don't think that there's a sense of collective imagination. You ask people what they're doing right now. They're doing washing, they're braaiing, they're at the movies, they're at the mall. We don't have a sense of reverence. And I think that there's a disconnect between what Ndate Ramaphosa is talking about and the real lived experiences of a majority of African people in this country.
Does there need to be a separate look at the type of freedoms that different people enjoy? So as a black woman, do I experience freedom differently and need to be able to experience freedom differently than perhaps someone of another race or another gender?
So the problem is that we have been extremely conciliatory, overly conciliatory to the European minority in this country. And the fact is also that in terms of the economy and in terms of the way that our public discourses are framed, there's an overprivileging of minority voices, and we don't really have a privileged African voice which is able to then frame what liberation should be for the majority of people in this country, which is why there's a whole generation of people which are disaffected. I think if you speak to people of the 4-list generation, young students, the so-called born frees or the born not so frees, they will tell you that they're not interested in this day. This is just a day to remember how unfree they are. And I've had the privilege of speaking to many people across this country who will tell you that a constitution doesn't do anything for them. It's a piece of paper that doesn't put money in their pockets. It doesn't put their children in school. It doesn't give them shelter. It doesn't help their RDP housing be any more stable, and it doesn't stop it from being washed away in the rain. So we have really been far adrift from a genuine, authentic liberation agenda, and I think actually the constitutionalism has distracted us to a great extent. Constitutionalism, it cannot be a proxy when there's a lack of economic equity and self-determination for the African majority in this country.
How do we address that lack of economic equity, and what solutions do you propose?
So there's several things. The one is that an educated nation is a winning nation. So we really need to look at our qualitative from 5 to 20 years old, from preschool to varsity, qualitative access to education, because of course, you know, accessing education when we see that children are walking 2-3 hours to school a day, that is not access to education. Secondly, excellent health and public health. I think it's a crime that hundreds of thousands of qualified, excellent public health specialists in our country are actually from our country, are working in the UK, are propping up healthcare systems abroad, when our own public health system is in a state of trauma. So that's the second thing. I think the third thing as well is also to look at different ways in which we can grow small businesses in this country and enable them to be able to survive the vagaries of markets. So that includes different loan extensions, different tax extensions, a different models of ensuring that they're able to gain some kind of a foothold into the economy. The other thing is things like price control, so that we can guarantee that most people are going to be able to access and the basic commodities at any given day. I mean, many countries have had things like your wheat board, your bread board, your poultry board, where you have a domestic market and a price which is guaranteed and which has nothing to do with what the international markets are telling us about. I also think, on a final note, that our natural resources, I think I've always found it quite bizarre that we're told that platinum and gold cost this amount per day and that we're not the ones who are setting these prices, and yet these resources come from our country. So I think that we need to have a real rehaul. The trickle-down theory of economic growth hasn't worked. Things don't just trickle down. By the time the water comes down, it's evaporated. So the benefits, by the time they come down to the person on the ground, they've evaporated. So we have to have a bottom-up economic policy, which is long-term looking as well. It would be really great if we stabilize our policy making and have a 10, 20, 30-year plan, instead of kind of shifting and jiving around every 2 to 3 years onto the next fashionable policy platform. And yet we could really, I think my theory is that almost anything that we've tried would have been effective if only it had been given the opportunity to take ground over a long-term period. Remember, change is intergenerational. It's not going to be a 3 to 5 year quick fix.
Policies that could change the way the South African economy looks and the way people benefit. The largest one, of course, is President Cyril Ramaphosa speaking about land redistribution. And saying that the time is now, it can't be avoided. We're also taking a relook at the mining charter and rights that come along with that. How long do you think, if these processes were implemented, we would see equality? And is it actually ever possible for the majority of citizens of a country to have these freedoms and this lifestyle that you spoke about?
So if they don't, then what makes them free and what makes them citizens, if in fact they're not accessing any of those benefits? I mean, the benefits of being a South African, a free person in any country, surely should be that you have a place to live, you know where you belong, you have a sense of community, you have an aspiration, an imagination which fits in with what everybody else around you identifies as being, you know, proudly part of that country. And I'll give an example. I think many countries have had, when we were growing up in Zambia in exile, President Kaunda used to talk about humanism, and it was something that everybody got behind, and it was from all levels. So you'd be told, if you even little kids, if your friend has 2 pencils and you have none, or your friend with 2 pencils, you know, give your friend with no pencil their extra pencil. So, you know, you need to be able to engineer a sense of common identity and common belonging. The land issue is very touchy because that, of course, is the bane of contention pre-1994, even among liberation movements. And I think that it's slightly disingenuous after 24 years. One would ask, what has taken so long for the governing party to begin to understand that the cry that many other movements, especially the Pan-Africanist Congress and to some extent AZAPO, have been making? What then has taken so long for this to now become a rallying cry? One would argue that it's possibly because the EFF have also been speaking about land restitution in different ways, and I think that it's really a program, a national program of action towards true liberation, which is far overdue. But I don't think that the planning around it seems to be embedded in reality.
Very briefly, you've spoken about how long it's taken. Is it fair to expect a system of apartheid and colonialism to
be undone
in 24 years? And are we not making progress with some of these rights that we've spoken about?
But why is it that it should, you know, this is why I say that the liberation, there's a difference between liberation and a freedom agenda, a kind of a constitutional freedom agenda. Many countries around us, you know, Mozambique, Zambia, Zimbabwe, Kenya, and others have had a sense in which immediately upon independence they did things which showed. I mean, there was state ownership. There was a sense in which they were showing that they were taking the helm of the economy into African hands, and that's not something that South Africa has been willing or able to do until now. What is taking so long?
Thanks so much for your time, Lebohang Pheko, a political and economic analyst. It's time for a short break. I'll have more news for you when we come back. Do stay with us.